Okay, we're continuing with ancient Greeks, paintings of them, and their history. This is Hippocrates, the great ancient Greek doctor. Has a lot of great quotes. He says, wherever the art of medicine is loved, there is also a love of humanity. And people take that for granted. What you don't understand is the modern medical system, it hates your guts. It considers you a talking monkey. And you say, oh, how could I say that? And I'll tell you, it's obvious. It's in writing, okay? It basically, the decision is made to make the American high schools, colleges, and grad schools based on the religion of atheistic Darwinism. If a biology professor were to bring up intelligent design to a class and teach that, he would be fired from his job. That would be considered a heresy. So what atheistic Darwinism says, it says that humans are just talking apes, talking monkeys, and they have no intrinsic rights, they have no intrinsic value. All this stuff about creating the image of God is not true. There is no God. There is no afterlife. Life has no purpose. That's what they're saying. Well, that's what you say about something. Whenever you want to mistreat someone, you first dehumanize them. Like before countries are going to go to war, what do they do about their planned opponent? They dehumanize them. They say, well, he's a homicidal maniac, therefore we must go in preemptively to defend ourselves, when they're really the aggressor. They do that all the time. And that's also done with the patients. I mean, basically, they've been described as talking apes with no intrinsic rights, no intrinsic value, no intrinsic meaning, okay? So then you say, well, what matters? Well, in atheistic Darwinism, remember what the conclusions of that are. The conclusions are might is right and survival of the fittest. Okay, well, what is might in the modern world? It's money. Okay, and who's got the money? The big drug companies, the big insurance companies, the big hospital corporations. So what they want is what goes. And what do they want? They want more money. And how do they make more money? By overcharging people and tricking them into getting services they don't need. Open heart surgery, let's say you got coronary heart disease. 100% cure with a low-fat vegan diet, Esselstyn diet. 0% cure with stents and cabbage. What do they all get? Stents and cabbage. Or bogus meds that don't work very well, like statins. So the point I'm saying is, what Hippocrates is saying is, where there is true good medicine, you have a love of humanity. You have Christianity, Christian ethics, okay, is the best way to get it in the modern world. So people say, you don't have to be a Christian, but you should have Christian ethics. Now you could say, oh, we don't need that. Okay, well, fine. Well, if you don't think you need that, then what are you going to get? You're going to get what you currently have, that you're just a mouse of vermin, and you take your drugs and your surgery and you shut your mouth. That's what you've got, okay? And you can't change that. No new technology can change that. Nothing can change that. And so what I'm saying is, the truth is sitting right here with this Hippocrates guy from 400 BC, and modern people don't understand this, and that's why their medical system is a piece of crap, okay? So I'm just telling you where it comes from, okay? You have to have Christian ethics. That which you do to the least of my brethren, you do unto me. The individual is more important than all the money. Because believe me, there's $100,000 for every dollar that you get from telling the truth. You get $100,000 for lying. So unless you have Christian ethics that say, this person is important, like a mother and a father, I love this child, I do right by this child, the money's always going to be to rip off and screw over the patient. Hippocrates was right about a lot of things. I'm going to show one picture real quick about Asclepius. He was the other sort of god of healing in ancient Greek, and they had a temple of Asclepius, and they would do different things there to try to help the patients. They had sort of like these spas and... Okay, here is Hippocrates. Walking is the best medicine. One of the best things you do, he says, all disease comes from the gut. Walking is the best medicine. Yeah, so eat a healthy meal and then walk afterwards. That'll put you in a long distance towards health. Hippocrates, all disease begins in the gut. There's way more truth in that than people realize. I made a video recently about Hippocrates visits modern medicine and the conclusions he would draw from that. And I can tell you, Hippocrates could cure more patients than modern medicine does. Now, you think that's a joke, but that's because you don't know. I do know, okay? The pills don't work for the common chronic diseases, which is like over 70% of diseases, whereas diet, nutrition, sleep, and all this stuff usually does. So Hippocrates was right again. When you get leaky gut, you get, abdominal pressure syndrome, autoimmune disease, all those problems. Let food be thy medicine. It's Hippocrates. More Hippocrates. If someone wishes for good health, one must first ask oneself if he is ready to do away with the reasons for his illness. Only then is it possible to help them. Yeah, you tell a person, well, you got to go vegan. The patient's like, oh, no, I don't want to do that. The same stupid patient that'll sign a craniotomy consent in 5 seconds to crack open their skull, they'll sign a consent in 5 seconds for chemotherapy because they believe that's all you can do. I did a surgical internship. I would consent patients very quickly for all these major surgeries. Okay, but you try telling somebody to go vegan, oh, no, I can't do that. Okay, they're fundamentally stupid at a level that you just can't help them. So you say, okay, have fun, getting drugged and chopped up. Okay, Hippocrates. Illnesses do not come upon us out of the blue. They are developed from the small daily sins against nature. When enough sins have accumulated, the illnesses will suddenly appear. Okay, and like, what does that sound like? If you're familiar with, there's this genius lady doctor. Her name was Lorraine, Day, and she said the same thing. She says, look, you can choose man's way or you can choose God's way, okay? Given that God designed all these humans, billions and billions of them, he knows more about mankind than any doctor does in their 50, 60, 70 years, 80 years of life. Okay, so what's the point? The low-fat vegan diet with no oils cures tons and tons of patients. Okay, pills, they don't cure anything. They can replace something that's missing. You can replace thyroid hormone. You can replace insulin for diabetes. Okay, but best thing for most people is just prevent the diseases with the healthy diet. Okay, and then, get your sleep, manage your stress, all those other things that go into it. Filter your water, get your sunshine, get your exercise. Okay, Plato was the big philosopher. So the big gang of three, as Edward de Bono calls them, is Socrates, Plato, and Aristotle. Okay, so Socrates came first. He was the older guy. And then Plato was his student and admirer of him. And Plato was a little pompous. He had wanted to be a politician, failed at that. He had wanted to be a playwright, failed at that. So he became a philosopher. And he was really good, and he incorporated his ideas from writing plays into writing philosophy. He'd have these dialogues, dialectics, where multiple different students would be talking, for example, to Socrates. Part of what he was trying to do with Socrates at that time, too, was vindicate Socrates, who had been accused and persecuted of things unfairly. But Plato was a little pompous. He's a little bit of a mystic. But in terms of being pompous, he would say things like, what is the definition of a human? He'd say a human is a featherless biped. So Diogenes, the homeless street philosopher we just showed a couple pictures ago in the previous talk, he took a chicken and he plucked the chicken and he said, behold, here is Plato's idea of a man, featherless biped. So there's a lot of funny stuff like that. The Greeks have a sense of humor, and that was a nice thing about them. If you want to learn about the Greeks, thegreatcourses.com, also called Wondrium, they've got a lot of courses, and these are good. Rufus Fears is the magnificent professor. These other guys are good. They're solid. I wouldn't call them, anything special or magnificent, but they're solid. They're good. Here's a guy who's magnificent. This is the best one. He's got a bunch of YouTube videos, not that many on Greeks, but some on Greeks that are available on YouTube. He's magnificent. He's a Harvard professor, super smart, super nice, real enthusiastic, funny, clever. He's everything you want in a professor. He's the best professor ever for anything at thegreatcourses.com, also called Wondrium. They own both those websites. So here's like one of his lectures on the Iliad, for example. Okay. He has a whole course, Famous Greeks and Famous Romans. I previously mentioned Edith Hamilton, great introduction to the ancient Greeks, the Greek way, famous Greeks, and they all say the same thing, The ancient countries before the Greeks, they all stunk. They're all sort of brutal despotism with a secular ruler who kicks everybody's butt and makes them obey. In Egypt, nothing changes for 1,000 years because nobody's allowed to do anything innovative. That's pretty much how most places are, some brutal tyrant. Okay, here's Zeuxis. He was the greatest painter, artist of that time. We lost all the paintings of Zeuxis and of Apelles, who was a later painter in the time of Alexander the Great. So we don't know exactly what they look like, but apparently they were magnificent. So we actually lost their knowledge. We kept their statues because the ancient Romans found them soon enough and made copies of them. But basically in this picture, Zeuxis, the artist, is trying to pick a model that he will use to paint Helen of Troy. And it shows you, the level of their sophistication. They've written all these plays and books and philosophy. They have theater. They have all this painting and stuff. Now here's a symposium, sort of an educational party. Supposedly the men are talking about educational things, but it also turns into a bit of a rabble-rousing with alcohol and women and, that type of party. You'll often hear educational symposiums say, we're having a symposium on such and such a subject. This is where it comes from. Plato's symposiums with Socrates and whatnot. Okay, and then the very famous student was Alcibiades. Alcibiades was a brilliant young guy. He was related to Pericles, and he was a bit of a philanderer, wild man, very good looking, like the best looking man in Athens, and all the ladies loved him. The courtesans, heterae, they're also called, are the educated ladies, and he was playing around with the ladies. Socrates comes looking for him for his teaching lessons. They didn't let the wives get too educated in those days. Here's another painting of Socrates having a conversation with Alcibiades. Good quote from Socrates: "The best we can do is seek to keep becoming better." Yeah, that's how you do the best you can with your health too. Okay. And he wanted to be the leader in the battle on Syracuse, but they took him out of it, and then that led to a disaster. Okay, there's Socrates teaching a bunch of students. And then Socrates was tried as disrespecting the gods, and he was brought before a kangaroo court, and he refused to try to weasel out of it, and he was sentenced to death to drink the hemlock. And this was, of course, devastating and sad for his student, his disciple, Plato. And Plato saw that Socrates, the best man in all of Athens, was persecuted and put to death. And he said, what kind of a city is this that persecutes the best man that it's been able to produce? So here's Socrates on his deathbed. This painting is by Jacques-Louis David in 1787. The death of Socrates was in 399 BC. And, just some quotes of Socrates. "The purpose of philosophy is to determine how we ought to live. In order to decide how to live well, we should try to learn what is good for us and what is bad for us." Okay, yeah, just basic intelligence. He's got lots of quotes like that. So this is Plato here sitting at the foot of the bed, just devastated and sad about it. The students are very sad. And so Socrates is like the saint of philosophy, just like Isaac Newton is the saint of science. Okay. And this was a big moment, okay? And Erasmus used to joke. He used to say, "Pray to Saint Socrates," okay? But it was a very sad moment. And Socrates was a brilliant guy. He's a great debater, great talker. He's a little bit of a hypocrite sometimes. He would accuse his opponents of sophistry when he'd be playing the same word games as them. But still, he's quite brilliant and entertaining to read about. Afterwards, Plato wrote many dialogues using Socrates as the hero because he wanted to vindicate Socrates. He also wanted to show the Greeks, the Athenians, a new type of hero. That you don't just have heroes like Achilles that are good fighters, or like Odysseus that are crafty in fighting and tricking women and stuff like that, but an intellectual hero who's heroic in their thinking and their bravery, their courage to come to the truth, even when it's not popular to do so. Here's a great allegory of the cave of Plato, that most of the people, the proles, we would call them nowadays, are sitting in the cave, and they're seeing things going, the shadows going on the wall, passed by the so-called storytellers. You would maybe call them the media. Okay, and they believe all the nonsense that's cast upon the wall. And what Plato is saying is you want to try to figure out how to climb out of the cave and see the real sunlight, the real absolute truth, the objective truth as best you can. Okay, and perhaps indirectly, Plato's referring to Socrates as being like the light, the real light, the sunlight outside of the cave. And later people would come to think of Aristotle as being the light, the true light, the objective light of truth outside of the cave. And, this idea of the stuff on the wall is sort of manufactured truth. It'd be like in the nutrition world of people saying, F- in your water is good for you, soy and caffeine and so-called good fats, all that silliness. Okay. And you could also say, the boob tube of the modern world, the television is like, Plato's cave, where the public is just fed nonsense, as well as, most of the popular mainstream channels tend to be primarily nonsense, okay? Look in the regular world, all the so-called experts in nutrition, almost all of them are phonies, liars, sellouts, okay? So it's hard to find the truth. It takes effort to find the truth. You can find it, but it's not easy, and it usually will come from somewhere that's not well known, doesn't have that much authority. Look at McDougal. Where did McDougal come from? Podunk, okay? All right, and so that's where it'll come from. Who was Burkitt? He was a missionary out in Africa. Who was that compared to the big Ivy League institutions, okay? And here was Kempner. Kempner didn't even want to make public appearances. He's like, look, my patients are cured. Isn't that good enough for you? Okay, so that's it. I hope you found that interesting or helpful.